Welcome to the NJ Criminal Podcast, and part 2 in this series.
One of the reasons why I wanted to have you back on to talk about this, unfortunately, at the end of March, he was just charged with another murder, a murder of a 15-year-old child, Maag Dumbiwa, who had gone missing in October of 2016 out of Newark, which would have, I don't know the exact date she went missing, but it would have been, once again, prior to Sarah Butler's death, but likely prior to Tiffany Taylor's interaction with him.
Yes, it appears we were originally told from the prosecutor's office it was in August, which likely would have put it ahead of the attack on Robin West. Now, when he was charged, the prosecutor's office changed it and said it was October 7th, 2016, so kind of in the middle of his other attacks. This Maag Dumbiwa was, as you said, a 15-year-old girl. Her family appears to have been a immigrant family from Northwest Africa, and she had been interacting with Wheeler-Weaver on some kind of online app, and she was last seen leaving her home in Newark, family's home, and 2.5 years later, her remains were found badly decomposed in a carriage house in Orange, an abandoned carriage house. There again, the remains were so badly damaged that it took a long time to identify it. I think what is it points to another thing that's rare about this case. Wheeler-Weaver was very, very impulsive. His attacks came so quickly that at times we journalists and editors working on the story had a difficult time keeping them straight. Keeping the timelines straight, because everything was happening right, the same day he would be interacting with and trying to cover up and trying to plan multiple murders. It's hard to keep a timeline straight, and so much is happening so quickly. And the other thing that is notable about it is that the age range and the kind of demographic range of his victims and targets. I mean, the fact that this girl was 15 years old, and then he also targeted sex workers in their 30s, that he met them through all these different apps and in person. Most kind of serial criminals seem to have a modus operandi that they follow, and his seems to have been almost entirely random opportunity.
What do we know about Khalil Weaver? What do we know about Khalil Wheeler-Weaver that may shed light on some of this?
We do know some. I spoke to his best friend. I actually met his best friend, Richard Isaacs, for a completely different story before I'd ever heard of Khalil Wheeler-Weaver. And I also interviewed a number of his high school classmates. The impression that I got is one that honestly is similar to other mass murderers that about whom I've done interviews, where most of the people in his high school knew him as a kind of a nerdy guy, preppy. His parents were both employed. He grew up middle class, and that for his high school was pretty rare. In Orange, a lot of the kids were influenced by street styles, and whether they were, most of them were not drug dealers, but drug dealers and rappers were very much the cool people to emulate, and he didn't do that. So he was kind of looked down upon, didn't date, a bit of a loner. But then you talk to his friends, Richard Isaacs being the primary one I found, who said Khalil Wheeler-Weaver is very quiet, but once you get him talking, Richard Isaacs described him as really funny, really dry sense of humor, to try to overcome his nerdiness, he started DJing parties and recording music. So he was also a tall, good-looking guy who was researching. His family members worked as police officers around New Jersey. So as he was committing these murders, he was also checking online to see what are the requirements to take a test to become a police officer, which is
unbelievable.
Terrifying if he had been actually able to succeed at that. And these searches would be back to back. He would search for things such as what's the most efficient way to knock someone unconscious, and then his next search would be how do I become a New Jersey police officer.
Right. You mentioned something in the article. A Google search of how do I poison humans. Very disturbing.
What's the fastest way to knock someone unconscious? What's the fastest way to kill someone? So it seems as though he was obviously, even if one were to remove for one moment the fact that he murdered and attacked all these people, he seemed like a confused young man who didn't really know who he was and was kind of growing into himself. In person, he's tall, good-looking. I think his insecurities about being able to get along with women would have passed in time. Once he got to know himself, I think he would have done fine.
Did he always live in New Jersey? As far as you know?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge.
And as far as you know, are there any other unsolved murders in the areas that he frequented that are open, that may be under investigation in terms of whether or not he was the perpetrator?
That's a good question. We haven't looked for cases that fit this MO on the presumption that we don't want to, even for a convicted murderer, we don't want to be the one. We would like to have such allegations come from prosecutors.
Right. Well, we'd like to to think that hopefully someone is looking into that.
Yeah. It sounds, obviously with the charges involving Mawa Doumbia, it appears the case is not over yet. That case has not been scheduled. I keep checking every couple of weeks to see, do you have a case scheduled? Will there be a case? Will there be a trial? And we don't know yet.
Right. The case obviously attracted national attention.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Not really.
No. Well, what has happened since the writing of the article in terms of interest in the story?
Let me take it before the trial and after the trial.
Okay.
First, when I discovered that there was a serial killer on trial in Newark, an easy train ride from Manhattan, I went in to the court assuming it to be mobbed, and that we would have to get on a list, that we would have to fight our way into the courtroom to get a seat. There was no one in the courtroom.
Unbelievable.
There was a reporter for the first couple of days from the Star Ledger, NJ.com, but she was pulled off the case within a couple of days.
What do you attribute that to?
Racism.
Right.
All of it's it's pretty obvious. All of the New York TV, radio, cable, and I won't say cable. I don't know about cable, but TV, local TV, radio, and newspaper reporters and editors who work on crime knew about this case. And the way we know they knew about the case is because they showed up to the vigil held for Sarah Butler at the beginning, and they all showed up for the guilty verdict at the end. None of them covered the middle. And that's because for everyone involved in the case was black, and with the exception, I believe, of Sarah Butler, I believe you can call that an exception, all were sex workers. And if one of the victims had been a cute blonde girl, this would have been one of the crimes of the century.
No doubt.
Instead, we were the only ones in the court case, and I think that's the travesty. So then, after we published this, and I I take a little bit of credit in saying
Mm-hmm.
that's a terrible story, but a great story. We need to cover
Mm-hmm.
it, and it didn't really cross my mind that like, oh, everybody's black,
Mm-hmm.
in all the main characters black, and so credit to my editors for agreeing with me on that. After we published this long story, the reaction was quite different. I've done some stories that received some attention from producers of podcasts, movies, and TV shows. I've received a few calls over the years. This one was completely different. I received dozens of phone calls and emails from producers. Everyone with a byline in the story did. My editors did. People at Gannett Corporate, who own the record, they received inquiries. It must have been over 100 producers and production companies approached us about acquiring the rights to the story.
What is it that you attribute the shift to? I mean, you and listen. Yeah. I read your article. It's a fantastic rendition of obviously a horrific series of events, and it's written in such a way that the truth of how he gets finally captured is evident, right? It's through, it's through, in this particular case, not the police, but through, as I've already said, the women that were involved. Do you think that is what makes this, when you tell the story, it's pretty darn clear. Now, I didn't watch the trial. I don't know what the prosecutor's theme was or what his opening or closing, what he said. But certainly, after reading your story, it's obvious. Do you think that's what it's from? What the shift in interest is based upon? The fact that you're shown the spotlight on these very brave women?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of factors. I think our story definitely helped to put the spotlight on this overlooked story. I think that there's a whole intellectual property industry of producers and their employees who go looking for awful and crazy crime stories. Mm-hmm. And I think in this instinct, that type of person, that type of people with that type of job had better news instincts than journalists did. I think news journalists, at least in the New York area, were playing by the old rules of black sex workers will go to the guilty verdict, but we're not going to cover this trial. And people in the IP industry helped along by our story. I think our story was kind of like a wayfinder. I think people found that first, and then once they did the double take, I think a lot of them did their own looking into the case as best they could because the trial was already over. Just understood that's a whale of a story, and we want to tell it.
Right. I'm always a big proponent of putting together, the timeline, right? And here we've got, obviously, looking back with 2020 vision, the timeline of how and when he committed the murders of these three women. But what is more interesting is the timeline of how he was discovered, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's the compelling story here.
It is, yeah. And that's how we wrote the main story that we wound up producing, was to say this, we journalists have done too many serial killer stories. This was a rare opportunity for us to turn the table and say the story here is the women, the victims and the survivors. They are the heroes of this case. They got involved in ways that we've never heard of women, victims and survivors getting involved. And so let's make the story about that. And you did. I think that recasting, I do think that the journalists who knew about the story and didn't cover it we're looking at the case, who was charged, and the victims, and saying, well, that's, as the Star Ledger NJ.com reporter, and well, the reporter was outraged, but as the editor said, nobody's reading the story. They were actually, according to this reporter, I haven't gone back and looked at the comments myself, but she told us in the courtroom as we were talking on her last day that the only comments that she was getting on her stories were from racist readers who said, you live in Newark, what do you expect? Which is incredibly racist and also wrong, because only one of the victims lived in Newark, only one of the meetings started in Newark, and none of the murders happened in Newark. So I think racism fueled a lot of the early response to this story.
Right. And now we know there is another individual who he is alleged to have killed a child.
Yeah, it's just absolutely tragic.
Right.
And we only know because we haven't had a day in trial yet. We know the bare bones of that case, but we know nothing like we do of the details of the other victims.
Right. But I think at the end of the day, we know that because of the actions of these very brave women that you highlight, no one else is going to be killed by him.
Yes, I mean, after his arrest, definitely. A question that we continued to ask ourselves and has been answered by the charges regarding the murder of Mawa Doumbia is, how many other people did he murder that we don't know about?
Right.
But after he was arrested in December 2016, definitely everything stopped.
Right.
So that's good.
Did you watch the whole trial or a bit or most of the trial?
I didn't know about it for the first 2 days of it.
Okay.
And then after that, actually, I'm not a court reporter. We had a couple of court reporters. Our court reporting team was a bit in flux during the time of this trial. So I kind of held down the main court reporting for about a week. And then our main courts reporter came in and relieved me so that I could go out and start finding, Robin West's parents and friends. I did a lot of street reporting and I found Tiffany Taylor.
Right, because that's the story, right?
Yes.
Right, that's the story.
Yeah. Somebody had to be there in court, and if we had been smaller, shorter staffed, I would have stayed in court. But since we had a more experienced court reporter to call on, that freed me up. And it wasn't just me. We had a whole team. My editors dedicated, I was tracked, maybe 6 other reporters to this. Not all full time, but there was a time when this consumed a large chunk of our newsroom between the reporters and the photographers. They really gave it every resource we had to make sure we had it buttoned down.
What's next? Will you continue to follow the case and the trial, presumably, of Mawa Doumbia?
Yes. I'll be, actually on Monday, I'll be reaching back out to the spokesperson for the prosecutor in Essex County. It was very helpful, asking her for any updates on trial dates. I did spend a week and a half in Newark, just after the charges were announced involving Mawa Doumbia, her murder, in April. I spent about a week and a half in Newark and in the Bronx, where public records showed that there are members of people named Doumbia with the last name of Doumbia. I found a lot of Doumbias. I didn't find anyone who knew this case or knew Mawa Doumbia. So I do hope to find them ideally before the trial starts, if there is a trial, to learn anything we can. Because as I said, we know so little about this poor child.
So we do not know how they would have interacted.
The prosecutor's office in their release did say that he targeted Mawa Doumbia online. I forget whether they said it was a dating app or whether it was just online app. So we know the barest of that, but I don't know what that looked like, what he told her, etc.
I thought one of the most chilling lines in your article was when one of his victims messaged him, "You're not a serial killer, right?"
Yeah, that was Sarah Butler.
Mm-hmm.
That was in terms of the conversation about national coverage, that did get a blip of national coverage. When we broke that out of the trial, there was a surge of stories, but everybody aggregated that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Nobody that, even that, Sarah Butler writing in a text to a serial killer, "You're not a serial killer, right? LOL." LMAO, actually, she wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Even that didn't get anybody to show up. So yeah, but it was just because she had a bad feeling. She went to meet him. She was planning on meeting him. And then she said in her text, "Your voice and the photos you sent me don't seem like a match." So I freaked out and I didn't go. And she said, "I feel really sorry about that, but I'm scared."
Right. Apologizing to him
right.
after she chose to meet him. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you for, your really thorough, I say investigative reporting, but it's more than that what you did here. You were able to, as all reporters do, go through the facts, and lawyers do that too, and create the timelines and all that. But you were able to kind of filter through the details that others in your position overlooked or didn't want to get into, and were able to really find the true story. The true story of these women, and the true story of their friends and sisters, biological and otherwise, that that ultimately put him behind bars.
Thank you for that. Yeah, they're really the trial here was really complex. The timeline was really complex. And once we got through with that, however, the writing of the story, the figuring out what the story should be about. I mean, the writing took some time, but it was very clear pretty quickly. The story has to be about the women, and it has to be gripping. We've got so many gripping stories to tell. We wanted to start with catfishing, but then we've got a very rare survivor in Tiffany Taylor, who's able to describe in detail how she's fading in and out of consciousness as he's attacking her and nearly killing her. We decided we had to go with that as the beginning of the story, just to really show his menace and her resourcefulness. And from there, it just flowed almost naturally.
Right, and thank God she was.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad. Yeah. I mean, she's got a daughter. She's got a mother who loves her very much. And she's got a really difficult life still, but she has people who love her. Yeah, and all of these women did and do.
Wow. Thank you again for sharing this incredible story.
Thank you.
It's
I really
disturbing, upsetting, but again, you were able to highlight these women, and I thank you again for coming back on the show to share this with us. And I invite you back. I know that you've indicated you'll be following this, and if there's any developments, I invite you now to come back on and share those developments with our listeners.
Will do. Yeah, I'll keep you updated and your listeners updated when we get some updates on Mawa Doumbia and the case with Wheeler-Weaver, especially if he comes back to court. I will let you know.
Thanks again, Chris.
That concludes our conversation and this series. Don't forget to subscribe for alerts. You're going to love our upcoming guests. This podcast is not a source of legal advice. No two legal cases are the same. Contact an attorney if you require legal assistance.